Good morning. I'm Kirsten Brady, GIS intern at Mile High Flood District. I'm currently pursuing my Master's of Urban and Regional Planning with an emphasis in environmental planning at the University of Colorado, Denver. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Mile High Flood District North Watershed Project Engineer, Mr. Drew Roberts, who is here to speak to us about climate change and the future of extreme weather events in our region.
Thank you. So what she didn't say is this is my first presentation, so if my watch goes off, it just means I hit my heart rate goal for the day. No worries. There's this Greek proverb that I've always liked that goes something to the effect of, communities grow strong when people plant trees whose shade they'll never sit under. And I've always loved this quote because it really drives home for me the importance of the decisions that we make. The choices we decide today will ripple for generations to come. The people in this room will decide how well their communities are able to respond to the coming changes. But before we dive into how we respond, it's really important that we set the stage about why it is that this even matters at all. So I've graphed here the average temperature every year from 1895 to 2023. And I've color coordinated them so that the colder years are blue and the warmer years are red. And what you'll notice as it progresses is that on average, almost all of the warmest years on record come in the last 15 to 20 years. And this is really important because warm air can hold more moisture than cold air. I was born in Georgia, I was raised up there, and I always remember the summers were hot and humid, and the winters were cold and dry. And cold is obviously relative to Georgia, but still. And so what happens is when you have warm, moist air that cools down, it can't hold that moisture anymore, and it has to go somewhere. And what happens is it gets almost pressed out in the form of water vapor or clouds. And I think that we're all familiar with what clouds do. So in a warmer climate, there is then more potential for extreme rain. I think of it as like the ceiling is higher on what can happen. But I'm a metaphor guy, so think of today, our current climate as a cup, and imagine the future climate as a bigger cup. They can both hold water. If I go fill them up, they can still hold more or less water. It doesn't matter. But what does change is the threshold. The bigger cup can hold more water, and if it spills, or if it was a bigger storm, there's more potential for chaos. So why does that even matter? I'm sure we're all familiar with lots of floods, but numbers, what does it really mean? Well, so I've graphed the economic impact of natural disasters across the US here. This is as a percentage of GDP, and so you can see that from 1960 to 2020, it's almost a 4 times increase in the cost of natural disasters. And when I highlight further the ones that are caused by rain, so that includes floods and storms, you can see that the majority of the costs from those disasters comes from rainfall events. But think of these numbers not from kind of like our perspective, but think of it from an individual's perspective. FEMA has a stat where just 1 inch of water can cause almost $25,000 worth of damage to your home. And a sudden $25,000 bill is an almost insurmountable problem for most families. The people in our communities rely on us to protect them from these risks, and often they might not even be aware that there's risk at all. And take it even a little further. When these floods happen, they're often a catastrophic event in the lives of the people who are affected. These impacts aren't just money. They're childhood photos. They're decades of memories. And they're the homes that protect our families. When these floods happen, someone, somewhere, is losing something they'll never get back. So where is this going to hit the hardest? And as all engineers, it depends. But it depends on how bad things get and what actions that we take. So this is a map of the 100-year storm projections from the National Climate Assessment. It's a measure of what the 100-year rainfall depths are looking to be. In the mild case, there's a county in Illinois where it's projected to get about 28% more intense in terms of rainfall depths. But when we look at the high impact scenario, we see that it gets much more extreme. This county, Aroostook County in Maine, is projected to get almost an 86% increase to their 100-year flood depths. And just imagine right now if suddenly our rainfalls were 86% higher. So the obvious question is, what's going to happen to us? And again, it depends. There's context. But the National Climate Assessment puts us at about 15% higher. It's important to note that there's a catch with that data. These national models are really good at getting kind of the broad strokes of what's going on across the entire US. But sometimes they can struggle with getting the real nuance of a certain area. You may or may not be familiar that we live in an area where there are mountains and there are not mountains. And so it makes it really hard for these big national models to, for us to feel confident in the results that we're getting in our real specific area. In order to address that, we are working with Applied Weather Associates to create a regional downscaled model for the district specifically. We're hoping to have this work completed by next year, and we can present the results at the symposium. But that's not the only way that people are tackling this. You may be familiar with Atlas 15, the update to NOAA Atlas 14. We're working with them right now, providing gauge data so that it can be incorporated with their models. And in 2024, they're looking at developing the framework and piloting it in Montana. And by 2026, they're anticipating completing volumes 1 and 2. Volume 1 being updated rainfall totals, and volume 2 being the climate projections. So I get it. So far, this has been somewhat of a doom and gloom presentation. I totally get that, and it's reasonable to feel that way. But this isn't an insurmountable problem. There's actions that we've already taken, and there's actions that we can take to help solve this. And I've always loved this graph from the early 1900s. It's a graph of the death rates coming from floods. So in this time span, there were a number of floods that were very devastating. And as a result, the US implemented the Flood Control Act of 1917, of 1928, and 1936. Now, besides just being an exercise in creative naming, these were the first time that Congress appropriated money specifically for flood control. And you can see in the following decades, the death rate from floods went down significantly. A huge win based on the work that was done by the engineers, the planners, and the policymakers before them. But then we fast forward, and it's in the 1940s to 1970s now. There were more floods. You may be familiar with some of them, the Colorado flood of 1968 being one of them. And so as a result of these flooding actions, there was more steps taken. In the 1950s, Illinois created the first urban flood mapping study. There was the implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP. And following that, the death rate went down again. And so when we zoom out and see the whole picture, you can tell that every time we did something, we put in work, we made an effort, there were tangible results. People's lives were better because of the efforts that got put in and the work that was done. But that's not really the question that we're here to answer. What we need to talk about is, here we are, and where are we going to be in the future? What steps are we going to take to make our communities safer tomorrow? Good news, we've already started, so we got a leg up. I was talking to Brooke the other day. She mentioned, and I didn't know this, that we are one of the only places in the country that has been mapping based on future conditions, which is really good because, as you probably know, the more impervious area, the higher the runoff. So I've mapped here, that was old Denver. It's developed a ton, and we're already accounting for that. So what is it that you can do? Well, there's 4 main steps that I want you to walk away from with this. The first thing is we need to plan for more intense floods. I don't have a crystal ball. If you know anyone that can project the future, let me know, because I do have some Powerball questions. I've got some notes, but outside of that, we know that generally things are going to increase. Secondly, we can prepare our flood responses today. Later in this symposium, Jen's going to talk about some of the implementing real-time flood warning sensors, and Bruce is going to talk about some of the improvements made to flood forecasting. Third, we can prioritize risk management. We've got 2 presentations later today as well. One from Derek Clark, which is going to talk about going beyond the fluvial hazard zones, and then David Anderson and Jeff Yeoman are going to talk about going beyond the floodplain. But generally, we know that floodplains aren't a binary in-out kind of thing. There's graduated risk across all of it. And then lastly, we need to create adaptable systems. Like I said, I don't know the future. None of us do. So we need to create systems that can change and are ready to adapt to whatever the future holds for us. I like Mary's note about safe fail versus fail safe. The idea I always think of is if you have a pipe network, as soon as it's filled up, there's no more room it can take. It's going to fail somewhere. You might not know where. It could be devastating. And instead, we try and focus on open channels that have an adaptable capacity, and hopefully they can safe fail instead of fail safe. So, coming back to this Greek proverb, communities grow strong when the people in them plant trees whose shade they will never sit under. We are making decisions today for future generations, and we have the ability to improve the lives of countless people, and it's up to us to make that a reality. Thank you.